It's nighttime. On the streets of Toronto, the theater crowd is braving the cold to walk to their cars. But inside Union Station, all is quiet. The commuters and business people have long since gone home. Yet the passenger concourse underneath the train shed is thronged with people. As you might expect, these people are waiting to catch a train. But they're here for no ordinary train. They're here to experience an amazing travel odyssey with one of the world's great trains. Join us as we travel across Canada and back in time as we step aboard the Last Streamliner. The Canadian departs from Union Station in downtown Toronto 3 days a week. The largest train station in Canada and the third train station to be built on this site, Union Station was built by the Montreal architectural firm of Ross and MacDonald, which had earned a reputation building railroad hotels such as the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa and the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg. The history of Union Station can be traced back to the mid-1850s. The first train station on the site was a simple wooden shed that was shared by the Grand Trunk Railroad, the Northern Railroad, and the Great Western. This station was eventually replaced with a second Union Station in 1873. From the late 1880s to the turn of the 20th century, the Canadian railroad industry changed dramatically, including the construction of a second trans-Canadian railway line by the Grand Trunk. In 1904, the Great Toronto Fire destroyed much of the area around the station. In the wake of the fire, the Grand Trunk Railroad bought land just to the east of the second Union Station. In 1905, the Grand Trunk and the Canadian Pacific decided to proceed with the construction of a third Union Station. In July 1906, the Toronto Terminal Railway was established. Equally owned by the Grand Trunk and the CPR, the purpose of the TTR was to construct, provide, maintain, and operate at the City of Toronto a Union passenger station. The construction of Union Station began in 1914. However, in August of that year, World War I broke out and construction was severely disrupted. Union Station was not finished until 1920 and did not become operational until after the completion of the switches and the passing tracks. Union Station was formally opened by Edward VIII, then the Prince of Wales. The Canadian is pulled by 3 General Motors electromotive F40 PH diesel locomotives with a combined total of 9,000 horsepower. The Canadian's consist is composed of 19 vintage Budd Company streamlined stainless steel passenger cars. These cars were built by the Budd Company for Canadian Pacific in 1954 and have been in continuous service ever since. This makes the Canadian the only vintage streamlined passenger train still in revenue service in North America. A journey across Canada aboard the Canadian is more than just a journey across a continent. It is a journey back in time as well. When the first Europeans arrived in what would eventually become Canada, they found a seemingly endless trackless wilderness. The only efficient method of transportation was by canoe. The earliest railroad to be built in Canada was the Champlain and St. Lawrence by Montreal entrepreneur and brewery owner John Molson, who backed the construction of the railroad in 1835 to reduce the travel time between Montreal and New York. By the early 1850s, the Canadian rail network had significantly expanded, partially as a result of the construction of the Grand Trunk Railroad, which stretched east to Halifax, west to Chicago, and south to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. In 1872, the Intercolonial Railway was completed, which linked Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to the Grand Trunk Railroad. The Intercolonial Main Line is still in operation today. Inaugurated in 1904 by the Intercolonial Railway as the Ocean Limited, Via Rail continues to operate the ocean as the Canadian's eastern transcontinental twin between Halifax and Montreal. As a result, the ocean is the oldest continuously operating named train in Canada. As the sun rises over northern Ontario, we find the Canadian rolling through the harsh, rugged landscape of Ontario's Precambrian Shield. The Precambrian Shield is a huge geological formation that stretches across much of Canada from Quebec to Baffin Island to northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. The billion-year-old granite of the Canadian Shield is covered with a thin layer of topsoil and riven with the scars of tens of thousands of years of glaciation. The combination of trackless muskeg, innumerable lakes and rivers, scrub forests, and windswept granite combined to create some of the most challenging conditions for railroad construction in the world when the Canadian Pacific Railroad was built in the 1880s. With a population of more than 160,000, the city of Sudbury is the largest city in northern Ontario. The first people to live in the vicinity of what would eventually become the city of Sudbury were the Ojibwe people almost 10,000 years ago. The first Europeans to arrive in the area were the French voyageurs in the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1859, Albert Salter visited Sudbury on a surveying expedition. While in the area, he discovered a series of magnetic anomalies which were strongly suggestive of significant mineral resources. In 1883, blasting in conjunction with the construction of the railroad uncovered huge quantities of nickel-copper ore, which was believed to have been deposited in an asteroid impact more than 1 billion years ago. The Sudbury Impact Basin, although now deformed by plate tectonics and weathering, is believed to be one of the oldest and largest meteor impact craters in the world. In 1901, the famed American inventor Thomas Edison visited Sudbury, where he discovered the Falconbridge ore deposit. Thomas Edison was unable to capitalize on his discovery, and the Edison Ore Milling Company went bankrupt in 1903. For much of the 20th century, mining and logging were the primary industries in Sudbury. By the 1960s, what little vegetation that had not been cleared in logging had been killed by the toxic smoke that spewed from the smokestacks of the Inco and Falconbridge mines. In 1972, Inco built the Superstack, the second highest industrial chimney in the world, at its Copper Cliff smelting plant, which is itself the world's largest nickel smelter. Over the past 30 years, the city of Sudbury has made great strides in undoing much of the environmental damage. However, decades of sulfuric acid rain have permanently stained Sudbury's once pink granite bedrock a dark gray. Not far from Sudbury is the town of Capreol. Incorporated as a town in 1918, Capreol has a population of 3,871 and was named for Frederick Chase Capreol, a promoter of the Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Railroad, the first railroad to be built between Toronto and Collingwood. Originally established as a divisional point in 1916, first for the Grand Trunk and then the Canadian National Railway, the town of Capreol grew up around the Capreol train station. As the Canadian continues to wind its way across the forbidding landscape of the Canadian Shield, the train passes through towns with names like Gaugama, Folliette, and Oba, before reaching Hornpain. Like Capreol, Hornpain serves as a divisional point on the Canadian National Main Line. Hornpain was founded as Fitzbach in 1915 when the CN Main Line first came through. The town's name was changed to Hornpain in 1920 in honor of the British financier Robert Hornpain. Following the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, Canadian Pacific held a 20-year monopoly over railway construction and operations. It was not until after the turn of the 20th century that additional transcontinental railroads, some of which were built on routes surveyed and rejected by Canadian Pacific, were constructed. The Intercolonial, the Grand Trunk, and the Canadian Northern all built and operated their own trans-Canadian railway lines. In 1914, World War I broke out following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In July 1914, British Prime Minister H. Asquith stood up in the House of Commons and formally announced that Britain was at war with Germany. At the time, Canada was a British dominion and was expected to join Britain in declaring war on Germany, which it did. The Canadian railroad industry would be vital to the war effort. By the end of World War I, the Canadian railroad industry was in rough shape. Overexpansion in the years leading up to the war, worn-out equipment, and price gouging had left many Canadian railroads on the verge of financial ruin. In 1919, Prime Minister Robert Borden intervened, ordering the amalgamation of Canada's struggling railroads into Canadian National Railways. By the end of the war, the automobile, once little more than an expensive toy, had begun to come into its own. As a result, ridership began to decline, and the railroads began to lose revenue to trucks. During the Great Depression, these factors, along with aging and worn-out equipment, drove many North American railroads to the edge of bankruptcy. In an effort to improve ridership and increase freight revenue, some railroads turned to streamlining. Borrowed from the aviation industry, streamlining sought to reduce air resistance by removing all unnecessary projections from a vehicle's exterior. With its modern look and sleek, minimalistic lines, streamlining caught the public's imagination, and it wasn't long before the railroads jumped on the bandwagon. The first streamlined trains in North America were the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's Bud-built Pioneer Zephyr, and the Union Pacific's M10,000, affectionately nicknamed Little Zip. In an effort to publicize its new train, Burlington arranged a speed run from Denver to Chicago, which the Pioneer Zephyr completed in an impressive 13 hours. The public was immediately sold on streamlined trains, and many of the premier trains in North America, such as the Santa Fe Chief, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Broadway Limited, and the New York Central's 20th Century Limited, all got streamlined makeovers. While Americans were caught up in the glamour of the newly refurbished 20th Century Limited, the clouds of war were once again gathering over Europe. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war, and the construction of the new streamlined passenger trains that had so captivated the public's imagination ground to an immediate halt. Production immediately switched over to war materials. Following the end of the war, as with the end of World War I, much of the rolling stock and other equipment was worn out and needed to be replaced. In Canada, as in the United States, Canadian Pacific and Canadian National found themselves facing increased competition from cars and trucks, while having to replace aging and worn-out rolling stock. In 1953, Canadian Pacific went to the Budd Company in Philadelphia and placed an order for 165 stainless steel domed streamlined passenger cars. Unveiled in 1955, the Canadian was the first all-stainless steel dome streamliner in Canada and made an indelible impression. Despite the glamour of the Canadian, both CN and CP continued to lose revenue and riders to cars, trucks, and airplanes. By the late 1970s, in an effort to save the faltering passenger trains, the Canadian government mandated the creation of Via Rail, which took over the CN and CP passenger services in 1979. In 1989, the Canadian left Union Station bearing Canadian Pacific colours for the last time. Around midnight, the Canadian stops at Sioux Lookout for fuel, a crew change, and to take on and offload passengers. With a population of approximately 5,000, Sioux Lookout is sometimes called the hub of the North. This is because the Sioux Lookout Airport and Highway 72 are within relatively close proximity of the train station. Sioux Lookout gets its name from Sioux Mountain. According to local legends, the local Ojibwe people used the mountain as a lookout point to keep an eye out for Sioux warbands. A lookout with a keen eye was able to spot the white birch bark of the Sioux canoes and get word to the village to hide the women and children, while the braves went to ambush the enemy. The town of Sioux Lookout was founded in 1912. For a long time, Sioux Lookout was just another sleepy Northern Ontario railroad town. In the 1920s, gold was discovered in Red Lake, and Sioux Lookout became one of Northern Ontario's most important aviation hubs. During the Cold War, the Canadian Air Force maintained a radar station in Sioux Lookout to monitor aerial activity in the Soviet Union. Before we turn in for the night, we take one last look at Ontario. The Canadian will cross over the Ontario-Manitoba border just south and west of Ann Lake just before 5 in the morning. The next morning, we awaken to find ourselves on the outskirts of Winnipeg, the capital of Manitoba. As we approach Winnipeg, we cross over the Red River floodway. The Red River originates from two distinct sources: Wahfenton, North Dakota, and Breckenridge, Minnesota. From there, the Red River flows north and slightly west from its headwaters to cross the Canadian border just north of Pembina, North Dakota. The Red River has flooded its banks on a number of occasions in recent history. In the wake of the flood of 1950, the Red River floodway was built. Much derided at the time, it was the largest earth-moving project in the world at the time of its construction. Crossed by both the CNR main line and the Trans-Canada Highway, the Red River floodway is estimated to have saved approximately $10 billion in flood damage since its completion in 1968. As the Canadian crosses the Red River and Pioneer Avenue, Winnipeg's Union Station can be seen in the distance. Constructed between 1908 and 1911 by Warren and Westmore, the firm that designed Grand Central Station in New York, Winnipeg's Union Station was constructed by Canadian National, National Transcontinental, and the Grand Trunk. For much of its history, the Winnipeg train station has been a major transportation hub. Between the 1880s and the 1950s, Winnipeg welcomed hundreds of thousands of immigrants, earning the nickname Gateway to the West. In its heyday, Winnipeg was the terminus for a number of transcontinental and immigrant trains, including the Great Northern's Winnipeg Limited and the Soo Line's Winnipegger. Situated at the forks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, the city of Winnipeg has a population of more than 700,000 people. The first people to inhabit the area around the forks of the Red River were the Ojibwe people. It is from a Cree word that Winnipeg gets its name, which translates as muddy waters. The first Europeans to settle in the area were French fur traders in the early 18th century. In the early 19th century, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company moved into the area. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company were bitter rivals, and fought fiercely for control of Rupert's Land, which was comprised of the Hudson Bay drainage system. In 1809, the Northwest Company built Fort Gibraltar on the site of what would eventually become the city of Winnipeg. Following the merger of the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company in 1821, Fort Gibraltar was renamed Fort Garry. Emerging as a distinct ethnic group in the 17th century, the Métis were the children of native women and British and French fur traders. In the late 18th century, they began to settle in the Red River Valley. In 1811, the Red River Colony was founded by Lord Selkirk. Cultural and religious tensions between the primarily Métis and French Catholic trappers and the primarily English Protestant settlers eventually boiled over following the death of settler Thomas Scott and resulted in the Red River Rebellion. In the 1870s, Winnipeg was seized with railroad fever. In 1877, the steam locomotive Countess of Dufferin was barged up the Red River to Winnipeg. In 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railroad completed the eastern leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, connecting Winnipeg to Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. With travel time over the forbidden Canadian Shield cut from months to days, immigrants flooded into Winnipeg and the city's population exploded. Winnipeg's railroad boom lasted from the 1880s until the 1920s. In its heyday around the turn of the 20th century, Winnipeg boasted the second largest rail yard in the world after Chicago. As we pull out of the station, we cross over the Assiniboine River before turning to skirt the edge of the Red River. As we turn away from the river, we pass through the CN Freight Yard. As we head west out of Winnipeg across the Canadian prairies, we see numerous grain elevators at trackside. In the heyday of the railroad, wheat trains crisscrossed Canada, bringing wheat and flour to Vancouver and Halifax to be shipped all over the world. About an hour after leaving Winnipeg, the Canadian pulls into Portage-la-Prairie. Portage-la-Prairie gets its name from the French word portage, which means to carry a canoe over land between two bodies of water. The voyageurs and fur traders portaged their canoes over the prairies between the Assiniboine River and Lake Manitoba. The first people to settle in this area were the First Nations 10,000 years ago. The first Europeans to visit the area were the French voyageurs in the early 18th century. The first permanent European settlers arrived in the area in the early 1850s. In 1851, Archbishop Cochrane of the Anglican Church, along with John Maclean and a group of ambitious settlers, purchased land from the First Nations not far from Crescent Lake. More settlers came, and it wasn't long before a school was built and then a church. The rich soil proved to be highly conducive to agriculture, which remains Portage-la-Prairie's largest industry. In 1857, a local government was formed, and by 1891 the population of Portage-la-Prairie had risen to 3,363. Portage-la-Prairie was formally incorporated as a city in 1907. Since its incorporation as a city, Portage-la-Prairie has maintained a slow but steady rate of growth. Today, Portage-la-Prairie has a population of more than 12,000. Over the course of its history, Portage-la-Prairie has become a major transportation hub. In the early days, this was due to its close proximity to the Assiniboine River. Later, with the building of the railroad, Portage-la-Prairie became a major rail transport hub. More than 70 trains a day pass through Portage-la-Prairie. It is also one of the only places in Canada where the CN and CP main lines meet, making Portage-la-Prairie a hotspot for rail fanning. 2 hours west of Portage-la-Prairie lies the whistle-stop town of Rivers, Manitoba. With a population of 1,993 as of the 2006 census, Rivers was named in honor of Sir Charles Rivers Wilson, the chairman of the Grand Trunk Railroad. As the Canadian continues west, we pass through Melville, Saskatchewan. Founded in 1908 and with a current population of 4,677, Melville was named for Charles Melville Hayes, the president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. Located 100 miles east of Saskatoon, Watrous was founded in 1906 and incorporated as a town in 1909. The Canadian serves Watrous as a whistle stop in both directions with 48 hours advance notice. As we continue westward out of Watrous toward Saskatoon, we skirt the edge of the Qu'Appelle River Valley. The footage we see here was shot from the eastbound Canadian. A tributary that connects the Saskatchewan and Assiniboine rivers, the headwaters of the Qu'Appelle River, are found in Lake Diefenbaker. Lake Diefenbaker is a man-made reservoir that was created as a result of the construction of the Qu'Appelle River Dam and the Gardner Dam. The first Europeans to settle in the Qu'Appelle Valley were fur traders from the Northwest Company, following the construction of Fort Esperance in 1789. In 1819, Fort Esperance was abandoned. In 1852, the Hudson Bay Company established a trading post at Fort Qu'Appelle, which eventually grew into a town of the same name. The Qu'Appelle Valley gets its name from a local Cree legend that tells of a spirit wandering up and down the valley, calling out who was calling. The first fur traders to visit the area reported the same phenomenon and would call in French, Qui Appelle. 2 hours after leaving Watrous, the Canadian arrives in Saskatoon. In 1882, a group of Ontario Methodists traveled west in an attempt to escape the Ontario liquor trade. They traveled from Toronto to Moose Jaw by train and from Moose Jaw to what is now Saskatoon by cart. In 1890, the Qu'Appelle, Long Lake, and Saskatchewan Railroad was completed, which resulted in an economic boom. By the 1930s, Saskatoon's initial boom time had ended, and the few who came to Saskatoon came looking for city work, as most of the farms around Saskatoon had gone bankrupt. During the Second World War, Saskatoon became a major hub of military activity as a result of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, through which Canada trained tens of thousands of pilots as part of the war effort. Today, Saskatoon is experiencing another economic boom. As a result, its population has jumped to more than 200,000. As the sun rises early the next morning, we find ourselves making our way through the outskirts of Edmonton. The first inhabitants of Edmonton arrived between 12,000 and 3,000 BC as the last ice age was ending. The first European to see the future site of Edmonton was the Hudson Bay Company fur trader and explorer Anthony Henday, who was seeking to establish trading relationships with First Nations groups in Western Canada. In 1795, the Hudson Bay Company established Fort Edmonton, which quickly became one of the Hudson Bay Company's most important trading posts in Western Canada. In the 1880s, Edmonton was seized with railroad fever in anticipation of the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. However, Canadian Pacific was almost out of money, and the House of Commons was unwilling to provide an additional subsidy to fund the construction of the line through the Rocky Mountains, which was the most expensive part of the line. The completion of the railroad was assured by the outbreak of the Northwest Rebellion in March 1885. Led by Louis Riel, who had brought Manitoba into Confederation and led the Riel Rebellion of 1869, the Northwest Rebellion was a last-ditch attempt to create a homeland for the Métis and the First Nations. Afraid that the Northwest Rebellion would spiral out of control, a force of Mounties was assembled and loaded on a train and sent west to Edmonton, where the Northwest Rebellion was quickly crushed. Edmonton was incorporated as a town in 1892 with a population of 700. In 1904, when Edmonton was formally incorporated as a city, its population had exploded to more than 8,000. This was thanks in large part to the railroad, which brought both immigrants and would-be prospectors bound for the Yukon and the Klondike goldfields. Edmonton's economic boom lasted from 1890 until 1914. Rampant real estate speculation coupled with the war caused the city's population to decline from more than 70,000 to 52,000 by 1916. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Edmonton's population grew slowly. Following the end of the Second World War, Edmonton boomed again. During the 1920s, Edmonton built one of the first licensed airfields in Canada, Blatchford Field, now called the Edmonton City Centre Airport. A number of pioneering Canadian bush pilots, such as Watt May and Max Ward, used Blatchford Field as a base of operations supplying native communities in the Canadian Arctic. In 1947, oil was discovered 30 kilometers south of Edmonton near Leduc. The subsequent economic boom gave Edmonton a new title, the Oil Capital of Canada. Over the course of the 1950s, Edmonton's population increased dramatically from 149,000 to 269,000. Edmonton's oil boom was abruptly ended by the Arab oil embargo and the Iran hostage crisis. These events, coupled with a sharp decline in oil prices and a lack of government subsidies, forced Edmonton into a long-term economic slump. The city did not recover until the late 1990s. In 1981, the West Edmonton Mall was opened. At the time, the West Edmonton Mall was the largest mall in the world. It remains the largest shopping mall in North America. In recent years, Edmonton has recovered from its economic slump, thanks in large part to a rebound in oil prices. This new prosperity has brought workers to Edmonton from all over Canada. On our way out of Edmonton, we cross the North Saskatchewan River. The Saskatchewan River rises near Banff, Alberta in the Canadian Rockies. The Saskatchewan River flows down from the toe of the Saskatchewan Glacier in Banff National Park and flows southeast alongside the Icefield Columbia Parkway, eventually flowing into Abraham Lake. Abraham Lake is a man-made reservoir created by the construction of Bighorn Dam. From Bighorn Dam, the river turns north and then east at Rocky Mountain House. From Rocky Mountain House, the Saskatchewan River flows east to Edmonton. It eventually empties into the South Saskatchewan River and Lake Winnipeg. The North Saskatchewan River bridges the Rocky Mountains and the Canadian prairies. For thousands of years, it served as a natural barrier between the Blackfoot and the Plains Cree. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the North Saskatchewan River served as a natural transportation route for fur traders and explorers. By the 1870s, birch bark canoes and York boats had given way to paddle wheelers. With the arrival of the railroad in the 1890s, navigation on the Saskatchewan River came to an end. 70 kilometers west of Edmonton lies Lake Wabamun. At 19 kilometers long and 6 kilometers wide, Lake Wabamun is one of Alberta's most popular recreational lakes. Economic development of the area began following the arrival of the Grand Trunk Railroad. A commercial fishing industry sprang up, and fish was sent as far east as New York. As a result of its relatively close proximity to Edmonton, Lake Wabamun became a popular destination for tourists. Coal dug from the coal seams surrounding the lake was sent to Edmonton to generate electricity, and eventually to power the electrical plants that sprang up on the shores of the lake itself. At the far end of the lake, on the opposite shore from the train, sits TransAlta's Sundance Power Station. The Sundance Power Station was built by TransAlta, Alberta's largest hydro company, in 1970. By 2004, long-term environmental damage had taken place, and TransAlta shut down all of its mining and power generating operations around Lake Wabamun. As Lake Wabamun disappears around a bend in the track, we approach Edson, Alberta. Originally named Heatherwood, the town of Edson was named for Edson Joseph Chamberlain, the vice president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. According to local legends, the town of Edson was built in its current location because it was the first patch of level ground after Wolf Creek, which had been rendered uneconomical due to rampant land speculation. When Edson was declared to be the local rail center, many of the smaller communities around it fell into decline. In the 1950s, an upgrade of Highway 16 resulted in an uptick in traffic. Today, the Yellowhead Highway is considered to be part of the Trans-Canada Highway. In the 1980s, a resurgent coal industry saw the opening of mines in the area, as well as the arrival of the paper and forestry industries, which remain Edson's largest employers. As we depart Edson for Hinton, we begin to catch glimpses of the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. As the rolling cattle country of Alberta disappears behind us, the Canadian begins the long climb towards Jasper. The foothills of the Canadian Rockies flank the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains and extend 20 to 40 kilometers out in front of the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. They extend from the Laird River on the British Columbia-Yukon border south to the border with the United States. An hour after pulling out of Edson, the train stops in Hinton for fuel and a crew change. Sometimes called the Gateway to the Rockies, Hinton was founded in 1911. The town was named for William P. Hinton, the vice president and general manager of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Initial settlement in the area was scattered along a 12-kilometer stretch of track. In 1888, a trading post was established at Prairie Creek to serve travelers on the Jasper Trail. In 1908, the arrival of the Grand Trunk Railroad resulted in the construction of a work camp for the building of a trestle that is still used by Canadian National today. In 1911, the Grand Trunk Railroad built a station at mile 978 west of Winnipeg, and it was from this that the town of Hinton was born. In 1916, the Grand Trunk line closed temporarily, and Entrance Alberta, so named for its position at the entrance to Jasper National Park, became Hinton's communication hub. Following the acquisition of the Grand Trunk by CN, the CN line through Bliss was abandoned and the Grand Trunk line through Hinton was reopened. In the 1930s, Hinton became a boomtown following the discovery of coal. However, the bust came quickly as a result of the Depression, and the population of Hinton plummeted to less than 100 people. In the 1950s, Hinton rebounded again with the construction of a pulp mill. Growth was so rapid that the village of Drinnanin was amalgamated into the town of Hinton in 1957. As we continue the climb toward Jasper and Yellowhead Pass, the Canadian approaches the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. The Front Range is a line of mountains stretching from central British Columbia southeast to the American border. The mountain ranges that comprise the Canadian Rockies are primarily granite in composition, and were created as a direct result of the collision of the Pacific Plate sliding under the North American Plate more than 300 million years ago, in a process known as subduction. As we climb into the mountains from the foothills, we approach Jasper National Park. Jasper National Park was named for a Northwest Company fur trader named Jasper Hawes. Jasper National Park was founded as Jasper Forest Park in 1907. It was granted National Park status in 1930 following the passage of the National Parks Act. Jasper National Park, along with Banff, Yoho, Kootenay, Mount Assiniboine, and Mount Robson, was declared to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1984. As the Canadian rounds the base of Mount Euless, we enter a tunnel. When we come out, we exit into Jasper National Park. As we enter the park, we find a natural salt lake. This salt lake regularly attracts bighorn sheep, elk, and other wildlife, allowing us to get up close and personal with nature from the comfort of the train. Around 4 p.m. we pull into Jasper. With an elevation of 3,484 feet above sea level, Jasper is the highest point on the line. The town of Jasper is located in the Athabasca River Valley, on the confluence of the Athabasca and Miette rivers. Jasper also lies at the convergence of 3 different mountain ranges: the Victoria Cross Range, Pyramid Mountain, and the Malign Range. The town of Jasper was first established by the Northwest Company in 1813 as Jasper House. In the early 19th century, Jasper was a stopping point on the trade route known as the York Factory Express between Fort Vancouver in what is now the state of Washington and York Factory on the shores of Hudson Bay. Jasper National Park was founded in 1907. The railway siding at the future town site was constructed by the Grand Trunk Railroad in 1911. The town of Jasper was initially named Fitzhugh after a vice president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. Not long after leaving Jasper, we fall under the shadow of Mount Robson. At 12,972 feet high, Mount Robson is the highest peak in the Canadian Rockies. Mount Robson is believed to have been named for Colin Robertson, a Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company fur trader who lived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Mount Robson totally dominates the surrounding region thanks to its great vertical relief. From Berg Lake, Mount Robson rises more than 7,000 feet to the summit. The north face of Mount Robson is heavily glaciated. Berg Glacier extends from the summit more than 2,600 feet down the mountain. Mount Robson's northwest slope, called the Emperor Face, presents a significant challenge to mountain climbers, and only a small number of ascents of Mount Robson are successful each year. As we leave Mount Robson behind, the Canadian summits Yellowhead Pass. With an elevation of 3,711 feet, Yellow Pass is the lowest mountain pass in the Canadian Rockies. Yellowhead Pass was recommended to the Canadian Pacific Railroad by Sir Sanford Fleming for its low elevation and easy grades. However, Canadian Pacific rejected this suggestion, choosing the faster but more challenging Thompson Pass instead. As we descend from Yellowhead Pass, the train turns a corner toward Valemount, passing the base of Mount Terry Fox. Mount Terry Fox was named after Terry Fox in 1981. Terry Fox was a disabled Canadian athlete who lost a leg as a result of cancer, and who died while attempting to run across Canada in an effort to raise awareness of the disease. At 8,700 feet high, Mount Terry Fox is a peak in the Selwyn Range in the Canadian Rockies. As we begin our final approach into Valemount, Mount Laurier is directly in front of us. Located in the Premier Range in the Cariboo Mountains, Mount Laurier is 11,535 feet high. Mount Laurier was named for Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the 7th Prime Minister of Canada. As with Jasper, Valemount lies at the convergence of three mountain ranges: the Rockies, the Monashee Range, and the Cariboo Range. The name Valemount was chosen in 1927. According to local legends, one of the CNR engineers was asked to walk from the end of the line to the location that had been selected for the new station. Not wanting to name the new town after the swift creek on which the town was to be sited, the railroad engineers and the work crews christened the new town Valemount, as the town was sited in a valley surrounded by mountains. Valemount was incorporated as a village in 1962. The late 1960s and 70s were a period of rapid expansion in Valemount, thanks to in part to the arrival of the Yellowhead Highway. In the 1980s, the boom ended as attitudes towards the environment began to change. In the 1990s, Valemount began to grow again in response to a renewed demand for timber products. Today, Valemount has begun to diversify and has attracted a large number of artists, craftsmen, and authors. Valemount has also begun to attract outdoor enthusiasts with its spectacular natural beauty. As we depart Valemount, the train hugs the bank of the North Thompson River. The water of the Thompson River originates from the Thompson Glacier, which is located just west of Valemount. The North Thompson River is paralleled for much of its course by Highway 5 and the CNR main line. The town of Blue River lies in a wide spot in the Thompson River Valley. The forests surrounding Blue River are home to large amounts of wildlife: deer, moose, bears, and eagles. In addition to its wildlife, Blue River receives the most snow in Canada. As a result, Blue River has become known as the heli-skiing capital of Canada. As we continue down the Thompson River Canyon, we arrive at the town of Clearwater. The largest community in the Thompson River Valley, Clearwater, British Columbia, has a population of 4,960. In the early 1860s, the region was flooded with prospectors bound for the goldfields of the Cariboo Gold Rush. Clearwater gets its name from the Clearwater River, which was named as a result of its clarity in comparison to the muddy North Thompson. As we depart Clearwater, we continue to make our way down the Thompson River Canyon toward Kamloops. Kamloops is located in the Thompson River Valley at the confluence of the north and south branches of the Thompson River. The first people to inhabit the area around Kamloops were the people of the Shuswap tribe. The first European to see the Thompson River was the Canadian explorer Simon Fraser. He named the river in honor of his friend David Thompson. The first Europeans to pass through the area were fur traders from the Pacific Fur Company in 1811. In 1813, the Northwest Company established Fort Shuswap in the area of what is now Kamloops. Following the merger of the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, Fort Shuswap became known as Fort Thompson. Not long after the establishment of a trading post in the area, the nomadic Shuswap people chose to settle there. Coexistence with fur traders was uneasy, particularly during the Fraser Gold Rush in the 1860s, but the natives proved to be of great assistance in keeping the peace among the often rowdy miners. The word Kamloops comes from a Shuswap word that means the meeting of waters. As we pull out of Kamloops, the train hugs the shores of Kamloops Lake. Kamloops Lake is 1.6 kilometers wide, 19 kilometers long, and 450 feet deep at its deepest point. The lake is bounded on all sides by steep embankments. The only level areas are near the inlet and outlet and around the creeks that also flow into the lake. With a population of 1,628, Ashford was founded in the 1860s during the Cariboo Gold Rush by Clement and Henry Cornwall. They came to British Columbia from England in the hopes of striking it rich in the goldfields, but they became convinced that this would be a futile endeavor and founded the town of Ashcroft instead, to give miners a place to rest their horses. They also sold flour and other supplies to miners on their way to the goldfields. As we depart Ashford, the Canadian continues snaking its way down the Thompson Canyon. As the train descends into the canyon, we will cross the Thompson River no less than 7 times before entering the Fraser Canyon at Lytton. Lytton was founded in the gold rush of 1858 by Edward Bulwer Lytton, the British colonial secretary at the time. For many years, Lytton was a major stop on a number of transportation links that made use of the Thompson and Fraser Canyons, including the River Trail, the Cariboo Wagon Road, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Cariboo Highway, and the Trans-Canada Highway. Since the completion of the Coquihalla Highway in 1987, Lytton has lost its status as a major stopping point on the way to and from the BC interior. As the Canadian passes through Lytton, we leave the Thompson Canyon and enter the Fraser Canyon. The Fraser Canyon was formed during the Miocene period between 23 and 5.7 million years ago, as the Fraser River cut into British Columbia's rising interior plateau. At 1,375 kilometers long, the Fraser River is the longest river in British Columbia. The source of the Fraser River is a dripping spring in the Fraser Pass, which is located to the southeast of the Yellowhead Pass. From its headwaters high in the mountains, the Fraser River flows north to the Yellowhead Highway, then west past Mount Robson into the Rocky Mountain Trench and Robson Valley. The river makes another sharp turn at Giscombe Portage, where it converges with the Nechako River at Prince George. From there, the river turns south, cutting progressively deeper into the Fraser Plateau. The Fraser Canyon stretches from the confluence of the Fraser and Chilcotin Rivers south to Yale, British Columbia, a distance of more than 270 kilometers. The area around the Fraser Canyon has been inhabited by humans for almost 10,000 years. The first people to live in the area were the Lower Fraser Salish. The first European to see the Fraser Canyon was the Canadian explorer Simon Fraser, for whom the river and the canyon are named. Fraser shot the rapids of the river and the canyon that were to bear his name in 1808 while searching for a navigable trade route to the Pacific. Prior to the arrival of the railroad, the Fraser Canyon was a significant impediment to travel in the BC interior. The few trails in the canyon were often nothing more than notches cut into the cliff face, and were regarded as little better than goat tracks. Since the 1880s and the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Fraser Canyon has become an important transportation corridor. Canadian Pacific, Canadian National, and the Trans-Canada Highway have all been blasted into the rock walls of the Fraser Canyon. Just down the canyon from Lytton are the Sitka Bridges. It is at Sitka that the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National main lines switch riverbanks. Due to the highly constricted nature of the Fraser Canyon, the CP and the CNR main lines change places several times as they make their way down the canyon to Vancouver. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the conditions in the canyon made railroad construction extremely challenging. Today, the trip from Jasper to Vancouver down the North Thompson and Fraser Rivers is considered to be one of the world's most spectacular train journeys. As the Canadian snakes its way down the Fraser Canyon, we eventually come to Boston Bar. Boston Bar was founded in the 1860s during the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. Boston Bar got its name as a result of the Pidgin English of the Chinook Indians who lived in the area. Many of the gold prospectors who came to British Columbia in the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush were Americans, and were called Boston men, or simply Bostons, by the Indians. Just down the river from Boston Bar is Hell's Gate. At Hell's Gate, the Fraser River narrows to less than 120 feet wide. More than 200 million gallons of water a minute flows through Hell's Gate at a speed of 25 miles per hour, twice as fast as the water flowing over the edge of Niagara Falls. The name Hell's Gate came from the journal of the Canadian explorer Simon Fraser, who wrote that Hell's Gate was a place where no human should venture, for surely these are the gates of hell. By the 1860s, the Fraser Canyon had evolved from a First Nations migration route and fur traders corridor to a highway for the prospectors headed to the goldfields of the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. During the 1880s, the Canadian Pacific Railroad undertook the construction of the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad, which resulted in the laying of tracks on the west side of the canyon wall at Hell's Gate. In 1911, Canadian Northern Railroad also used the Fraser Canyon to build its main line to Vancouver, laying tracks on the south and east walls of the canyon. Some conservationists and biologists have asserted that the rubble thrown into the canyon from the blasting of the roadbed during construction of the railroad has significantly narrowed the riverbed. In 1914, a rock slide at Hell's Gate resulted in a 5-meter drop in the level of the river and an increase in the velocity of the water funneling through Hell's Gate. In an attempt to reverse the ecological damage, tons of debris were removed from the river and Hell's Gate was declared clear. However, the locals disagreed with this assessment. As we continue to make our way down the Fraser Canyon, we come to Hope, BC. At Hope, the train, along with the Fraser River, exits the mountains and enters British Columbia's lower mainland. The first people to inhabit the area around Hope were the First Nations approximately 10,000 years ago. The first European to see the area was Simon Fraser during his 1808 expedition. In 1858, Hope became a boom town during the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush, and a town site was laid out later that year by Governor James Douglas when Hope became part of the colony of British Columbia. During World War II, Hope was the site of an internment camp for Japanese Canadians. During the last ice age, the area that would eventually become the Fraser Valley was covered by a thick sheet of ice. As the ice retreated, the Fraser Valley was flooded with glacial meltwater. Eventually, the water subsided and the valley floor rose up, creating the landscape that exists today. As the Canadian makes its way through the lush farmland of the Fraser Valley, we come to Chilliwack. Chilliwack is located approximately 100 kilometers east of Vancouver. To the north, Chilliwack is bordered by the Fraser River, and the Canada-US border to the south. The first people to live in the area were the Lower Fraser Salish, also known as the Stolo people, between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. In 1857, gold was discovered in the Fraser River, and many of the stampeders who came to the area in the Fraser River Gold Rush came by way of Chilliwack. The township of Chilliwack was incorporated in 1873 as the third municipality in British Columbia. From the 1850s to the 1870s, the steamboat was the primary method of transportation on the Fraser River. With the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railroad in the 1880s, traffic on the river mostly dried up, with the exception of the ferry across the river to the nearest train station at Harrison Mills. Hemmed in by the river, the town of Chilliwack began to grow to the south, to the junction of the New Westminster-Yale Wagon Road, Wellington Avenue and Young Road, an area known as the Five Corners. In the 1880s, the subdivision of Centerville was established. Its name was changed to Chilliwack in 1887 and incorporated as a city in 1908. There is also circumstantial evidence to suggest that Sir Francis Drake visited the area in 1579. The first European to actually set foot in what would eventually become the city of Vancouver was the Canadian explorer Simon Fraser in 1808. In the 1850s, the Fraser Gold Rush brought large numbers of people to the area for the first time. By the 1860s, the first permanent settlers had settled in what would eventually be called Gastown, around the tavern built by Gassy Jack Dayton. In the 1880s, the colonial government surveyed a town site which it called Granville, in honor of the British colonial secretary for the colonies. As a result of its natural harbor, Granville was selected as the western terminus for the Canadian Pacific Railroad in 1884. Vancouver was incorporated as a city in 1886. Later that same year, William Cornelius Van Horn traveled to Vancouver to confirm its position as the western terminus for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. The arrival of the CPR, coupled with the discovery of gold in the Klondike, turned Vancouver into a boom town, as immigrants came west to settle while prospectors went north looking to strike it rich. By the 1920s, the local economy was dominated by the railroad and logging. Vancouver also had an active and militant labor movement. In 1903, railroad workers went on strike against the CPR for union recognition. In the lean days of the Depression, Vancouver suffered unrest again, when homeless and unemployed workers flooded the city to protest the conditions in the work camps located in the remote corners of the province. These protests would eventually trigger the On to Ottawa trek. In 1929, Vancouver took on its present boundaries, following the amalgamation of Vancouver with Point Grey and South Vancouver. Around the same time, Vancouver also became the third largest city in Canada. As we arrive in Vancouver's Pacific Central Station, we come to the end of our journey. Our train trip across Canada has been more than just a transcontinental rail journey. We have traversed the granite of the Canadian Shield, the wide open spaces of the Canadian prairies, and wound our way among the majestic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Our journey has also been a journey through time as well as space. We have watched the rise of bustling cities and visited sleepy railroad towns passed over by time. As we disembark, we remember that it's the going and not the getting there that's good.